final panel of the day is entitled Sensitive Treatment of Cultural Properties. And I'm glad that we're coming to this topic, a panel that has the word properties in it, because it gives me a chance to correct a little bit an impression that I might have created in the morning, which is that what we're dealing with here is a dichotomy between thinking about buildings on the one hand, thinking about built heritage and architecture on the one hand, and thinking about intangibles on the other, as if these are two distinct categories that don't overlap. You could care about buildings, you could care about intangible values, but those are different things. And I don't think that's the way most people think about it. And I really liked the phraseology that Tim used in the lunch panel about spatializing intangible heritage. Because this idea of the intersection of a place, space, and intangible values is, to me, the center of the historic preservation inquiry. So lots of disciplines think about these topics: ethnography, folklore, anthropology, sociology. Lots of people think about them. And we, in historic preservation, when we think about them, often our kind of unique contribution, or at least our emphasis, is on the interrelationship between these usages, values, customs, and a place. We really are in situ, as people sometimes say, thinking about how these live and exist and are shaped and shape spaces, whereas a folklorist or an ethnographer might not be so focused on that, although it certainly is an element of what they look at as well. So, hence we get our afternoon panel on sensitive treatment of cultural properties. And although it's not the only thing we're going to talk about, a particularly interesting kind of case study concept that focuses this inquiry is the idea of a place, let's say a building, that has cultural value, but not values that are immediately tethered to the architecture of the building. So you have a structure, and the structure has values, and those values may be legible, as experts say, legible on the built fabric, or they may not be so readily legible. And so let's just posit a building that has value to the community, social value, cultural value, and those values aren't in the most obvious way tied to the building's architecture significance, if it even has architectural significance. And so comes along a person who wants to change that building so that its use can't be continued, so that its function differs, so that its traditional role in the community is changed, and that goes through a design review at a historic preservation commission. Well, they're going to be applying architectural design standards, and how are those going to get at really the questions that are presented about the valuable uses and the connotations and memories and associations of the building. So we get to this interesting question of when we're dealing with place tethered, I'm stealing another turn of phrase from Tim, place tethered intangible values, and so we're sort of dealing with a building or a place, and that seems quite familiar, and so fine, we know how to deal with buildings, and then we put it through our building process, and then we find we're not getting at the heart of the question, really. And so that's, I think, the kind of thing we want to explore with this panel. How do you treat cultural properties where the significance of the property may not be as readily legible on the built fabric as with some of our more iconic architectural landmarks? I have to apologize, I don't remember if we agreed on an order. Did we?
Me, Ege, Tim.
Thank you, Don. So I think you've met all the panelists. I'll reintroduce Donna Graves from San Francisco, and to her right, Tim Frye from San Francisco, and Ege Yildirim from Istanbul. So, Donna?
That was a perfect introduction, because really what I'm going to be talking about is the value of stories, which often are the intangible, invisible parts of places that we want to protect and lift up. And I'll also show my hand that I see this kind of work as a tool for social justice, for creating the kind of resilient, inclusive communities that Andrew was referring to before. And I think that there is no better moment to be having this kind of discussion. Current debates over whose memorials should have pride of place are an indicator of how sensitive it can be when we make choices about how and where we remember the past and which past we choose to recall, these are never neutral decisions. So these quotes by art historian and writer John Berger and poet Audre Lorde, "Never again will a single story be told as though it's the only one, and there is no such thing as a single-issue struggle because we do not live single-issue lives." I used them in an article I wrote recently for the National Council on Public History titled "In Praise of Multi-Story Places," where I argued that there are really very few places that hold only one story. History, on the other hand, is often told in a kind of singular, linear way, and our preservation programs themselves certainly favor them. Guidelines steer us toward highlighting certain aspects of significance or historical importance and defining a period of significance. And these are generally narrow and have to fit within pre-existing rubrics. I have the privilege right now of writing National Register of Historic Place nominations for two sites that I'm going to talk about briefly today that I think make a powerful case for lifting up these kinds of places that tell multiple stories. The building you're looking at in San Francisco's Mission District was originally constructed in 1910 as a German social and athletic hall. The Sons and Daughters of Norway took it over in the 30s, and by the late 70s, when they were no longer using it very actively, a group of radical feminists, many of whom were lesbian, bought it and made it the Women's Building, which describes itself as the first woman-owned and woman-operated community center in the U.S. It's one of the very few surviving women's centers that were created during the second wave feminist movement, and it's a location where the fight for women's rights was very self-consciously linked to other community struggles. In doing research on this project, I interviewed Roma Guy, one of the founders, and she told me, "We understood that we can't have real social change for women unless we connect with all people's issues because women are everywhere." Since its founding, this place has been an anchor for the history of women, feminists, LGBTQ people, immigrants, and progressive groups more generally throughout the Bay Area. And it's really proved to be an early laboratory for exploring and enacting what is now termed intersectionality in the U.S. And I think all of you were sent links by Claudia and Lauren of these blog posts that were posted by the National Trust in the last few weeks, one of which is about historic preservation and intersectionality. That's really excellent. I hope if you haven't read it, you'll take a minute to peruse it. The Women's Building has hosted or sponsored a range of events and projects that connect local, national, and international community issues. And it's because the founders had the chutzpah and foresight to purchase that building. It's still an active part of the city's social ecology. So it's definitely a cultural heritage or legacy business site. The other place I'm working on a nomination is the Japanese YWCA, which takes us back to Japantown. This nomination is being funded under a National Park Service civil rights grant that the city secured. This building is from 1932. The Japanese Y dates to the teens because YWCAs were segregated until after World War II. So actually there were several segregated Ys in San Francisco, a couple of which were designed by famed architect Julia Morgan, like this one. This building was erected through efforts of Japanese immigrant women and their American-born daughters. You see some charming young women as part of the building campaign. But during World War II, of course, when all Japanese Americans were forced to leave Japantown and the entire West Coast, the parent YWCA began leasing the building to the American Friends Service Committee, an arrangement that lasted until 1959, and an arrangement that ushered in many events associated with the building that gave multiple layers of significance to that modest little structure. Japantown had become home to many African Americans during the war who'd migrated to San Francisco for defense jobs. And one of the things I found was that in 1944, the Friends brought Bayard Rustin, who you see in the front, that image on the left, to teach a 7-week intensive study course at the Japantown Y for young people on nonviolence and civil rights and racial discrimination. Rustin, as many of you know, went on to become a major figure in the African American civil rights movement. He was the leading organizer for the March on Washington, and has been, in some ways, sort of pushed to the side of civil rights history because he was gay. So it brings us back to queer history. And we found another association with this building, an unexpected aspect of significance during the course of research for that citywide LGBTQ historic context statement that Tim referred to. My colleague and I discovered that this building was the location for the very first national convention of the Mattachine Society, the first, what was then called homophile organization in the United States. And that convention was held in the Japantown Y in 1954. The women of the Japanese American community weren't able to reclaim this building. And in subsequent decades, the Y kept saying that, the parent Y kept saying that it was going to sell it, and finally firmly announced in 1996 that it was putting it on the market. This inspired one of San Francisco's most notable instances of civil rights organizing. Legal scholars and community members aided a consortium of Japanese American churches who filed a lawsuit claiming the building rightfully belonged to the community. They prevailed in a settlement which resulted in the building's purchase by its current owner, Nihonmachi Little Friends, a culturally based preschool. I'm going to show you one more place that I think of as a really resonant multi-story site. I'm not writing a nomination for it because it's already a National Historic Landmark District, and that is San Francisco's very grand Beaux-Arts Civic Center. So it has designation for its architecture and its urban design, but this area holds incredibly powerful and personal meanings for countless Bay Area residents. It's the place where people come to speak truth to local, state, and federal power. It's drawn activists for marches, rallies, demonstrations, performances, and sit-ins over many, many decades. In 1934, this was the place where waterfront union organizers held protests for their massive strike that spread to the entire West Coast. Civic Center retains special meaning for LGBTQ history. People remember the White Night riots after Dan White was given a lenient sentence for assassinating Councilmember Harvey Milk and Mayor George Moscone. But they also remember joyful pride celebrations here and many protests around the HIV/AIDS epidemic. It holds national significance as well as the site of a major 1977 sit-in by disability rights activists that turned the tide towards passage of the Americans for Disabilities Act. And as I said, over the decades, it's been the locus of important mass celebrations and mass actions against wars and police brutality and for civil rights, immigrant rights, and many more social justice issues. These pictures are just from last weekend's anti-hate rally. So in all of these examples I've shared today, rich, complex stories aren't fully or even partially conveyed by the buildings and the spaces around them. Because this is common to so many sites that have profound legacies, I would submit that a critical component of intangible cultural heritage is made up of stories. They are among the most powerful ways we have to make sites relevant. Here's a quote by the always insightful Rebecca Solnit. We work, and we've talked today a lot about identifying, documenting, and protecting places that have meaning, but without storytelling, or to put it another way, interpretation, we're not really going to meet our fundamental heritage goals. Multi-story places, like I've shown you, can be a tool for identifying and highlighting areas of mutual concern and also reinforce social cohesion and community resilience. And the conveying of those stories shouldn't just be an afterthought where interpretation comes in as a mitigation measure. I really believe we should be thinking about this from the very beginning as we assess and inventory and gather data on places that are meaningful to communities. Our field has obviously begun to recognize that others can help us in creating storytelling that connect with users and visitors in powerful ways. Artists are among these groups. My early career was in arts organizations and arts museums. And I think the thing I most value from the years I spent working with artists was learning to embrace the uncertain, the open-ended, and the provisional. We often think we have to have the final word. We have to be able to nail down that period of significance. We have to feel as if we've covered all the stories. But that's sort of hubris to think that we can ever completely tie things up in a bow. Philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah's recent book on idealism elevates the idea that we have to accept that our understandings are provisional and incomplete. Perfect understanding is unattainable, and that it's really only through complex and imperfect descriptions of the world that we're going to get closer to what we might think of as the truth. It isn't always easy to translate those qualities to preservation, but if we understand that we don't and probably can't create the final word, and if we see our activities as creative acts rather than just technical or regulatory, I think we're going to be moving there. I definitely take heart in the conversations we've had this morning. So I'm just going to show you a couple projects that are either identified as art or I think of as art that show just a few examples of ways that art can illuminate places that hold meanings at all scales, from the grand to the everyday. This is a recent project in Philadelphia by the artist Lily Goodspeed. It's called Plaque to the Future. She's invited people to share their own place-based memories. Some of them are really silly, some of them are profound. This one's kind of silly, but also profound in that it illustrates, in a humorous way, experiences people may have that they didn't know, that they have in common. And in this case, it was people realized that they'd had breakups in the exact same park. So once we find these different ways to connect with each other and place, I think it strengthens the bonds that we all hold. The last image I'm going to show is of an event that was called Braided Across Borders that took place on January 20th at the border between El Paso and Juarez. Did anybody see this, or was anyone familiar with it? I found it very moving reading about it from afar. One of the organizers of Braiding Borders stated, "We wanted something that referenced women directly, but that also sends a message about our common heritage and common backgrounds in a broader context." I don't believe that this was organized by artists, but it has the memorable quality attached to place that I think we're trying to get at and that I think we can strive for. I'm ending with this image because it represents metaphorically my highest hopes for what our work can do, which is using places to offer new understandings of ourselves and other people. At its best, exploring the past can create a shared space that surfaces deep meanings and at times conflicts we've buried. But it also has the power to connect us more closely together across time and space. Thank you.
Donna, that last slide struck a chord with me personally, because I have a sister who's a filmmaker. She wrote a screenplay for a film, which was about two sisters, so semi-autobiographical. And the film's poster is two girls with a braid like that, so I'll tell her I saw it here. Good afternoon again, everybody. Hello. Throughout the course of the day, I've come to... do you have the presentation? It'll come, I suppose it's here. Oh, I have to do something, perhaps. Yeah, sorry about that. Okay. So, throughout the course of the day, I've come to realize that the San Antonio Historic Preservation Office is looking for, like, very specific things, and you have very good guests who provide very good specific answers. Now, what I'm going to say now is going to probably look a little too diluted for your taste, but it might have some merit anyway, so I'm going to just go ahead with it, and you never know what you get out of it, you know. So I began to prepare for this session with, looking at the title, Sensitive Treatment, and I thought, what an interesting word, really. It's not like the most classical preservationist technical term, treatment, but it's creative, and you know, actually, what does it mean? I started to think about it, and so maybe a little philosophical thing. But I think what we really come back to at the end of the day with treatment is like looking after a place, just like the Bura Charter said, and we're looking to retain the cultural significance and the values, and everybody's been actually somehow talking about the values of places in their own way, in different ways. And I wanted to go through this very classical and perhaps boring list of different types of treatment in our technical field. You have, you know, physical intervention levels. They all have their own particular meanings. It depends. The meaning shifts from the new world to the old world. Sometimes, you know, there's different European meanings for some terminologies, etc. There's also the non-physical interventions, which we treat places with social tools. I think that's more to the point of this event, of course. Presentation and interpretation is really key. I fully agree, and I'm going to actually dwell on that a little bit in a while, in a more macro way again. Visitor management, cultural programming, and of course the urban level interventions. I'd also like to dwell a little bit on the urban level, because also this focus of today's talks seem to be more on like development review on a single plot based, you know, site based, but maybe we can take a step back and look at the districts in their cell, or the city, how the city actually constructs its own identity. This is a very fashionable topic, you know, with competitive, creative cities and all that. But I think it might have some relevance for us, because if you have a bigger picture telling a story of a bigger place, you could still connect to that and use that perhaps as every site contributing to that bigger whole. I think that's still a relevant argument. And of course, the technological advances cannot be ignored, with the crowdsourcing possibilities, the digital tools we have. And I'd like to lastly emphasize what's called site management. In the morning, I briefly mentioned this management plan that San Antonio also has for a World Heritage Site. I would love to sit down and read it actually sometime, I hope when I have time soon. I'm very curious. One of the most important things about management plans is the governance, the stakeholder coordination, communication aspects of it. And I think repeatedly in the tables today, it was coming up about, you know, the language or the persuasion or, you know, the enmities or how to win over. And so there's always this communication component of things. And the digital surveys and mapping, they're also looking at the graphic communication of an idea. It's telling a story graphically. So I think we have to tap into the power of site management planning and the site management processes to coordinate different attitudes, interests, activities together to make sense of a bigger whole. So these are just some thoughts about the word treatment for you. And I wanted to come back to ICOMOS doctrines again. I think that's kind of my role, my duty here. I have to, you know, do my ICOMOS SDGs focal point thing. There are two particular scientific committees of ICOMOS, the Historic Towns Committee and the Cultural Tourism Committee, that I just wanted to honor here for you. Just conveying some messages, some presentations done earlier in different occasions by our Civic Committee President, Sofia Avgirino-Kolonias, and also ICTC Sue Miller. Not her exact slides, but the ICTC Charter. It's the International Year of Tourism, the United Nations International Year of Sustainable Tourism in 2017. I don't know if you're aware. And in our table, Vincent asked a question about tourism, which kind of gave me this inspiration about dwelling a little bit more on that. Because when we say how to treat significant properties after landmarking, you could interpret it as, okay, you've taken care of the defenses, you've secured them, but now how do you keep it living? How do you proactively, positively, celebratorily do things with it that mean something for the life of the community? Then we come into the more socio-economic, field. How to make them economically and socially viable. And the storytelling is part of making it socially viable, but I think we can look at it from an urban policy, urban management perspective as well, hence tourism. So coming back to Civic, what they say, basically the most important doctrine they have right now is the Valletta Principles for the Safeguarding and Management of Historic Cities from 2011. More and more, the urban heritage discourse is converging with the sustainable urbanization discourse, sustainable development. So some concepts that they touch on, the changes happening around the world, and we were just in New York this week at the United Nations high-level meeting on the new urban agenda. You might have heard of it, it was really interesting to see how the UN has not yet gotten switched on to the reality that all sustainable development problems are virtually urban problems. You know, and now more of the world's population is urban rather than rural. We passed the 50% mark in 2007, and we're going to eventually come to the 100% mark in our lifetimes. The United Nations system has to actually look at things with an urban in a pair of eyeglasses, and it's surprising they still haven't done it, and there are growing pains discussions about that right now. So let's move on about what else they say. It's the historic city is a reference model for urban sustainable development policies. So this is, for example, maybe a card we hold in our hand, and sometimes I think we need ready arguments to persuade stakeholders. And these are very obvious perhaps to us, but I think it's good to revisit and to know our communication kind of cards. What are those very big concepts that help us and remind us of the big picture? Integrated conservation for resilience, as Donna also mentioned. Safety, inclusiveness, and responding to the crises happening around the world, changing urban landscapes with refugees, and the role of culture as a healing force, as a binding peacemaking force. Inclusivity, guaranteeing the quality of life, cohesion of society, dialogue, respecting different kinds of traditions, multiple cultural particularities of different urban populations. This came up a lot, as you know. I'm going to go through a little faster. So a lot of messages from the urban heritage constituency that would help, I think, San Antonio, perhaps. You might have already done this. This didn't come up today. I would like to get a clearer picture of it. Like maybe there is a very robust, historic urban identity in place. I mean, we're talking about the Alamo, the missions, but I think that is. It sounds to me like a cultural landscape nested in a city. But I don't know how much the city is actually integrating that resource into urban programs, things for the different urban groups. So I think that there's a lot of potential. And coming to the other topic I wanted to emphasize, the tourism component. You can see in the Americas, international tourist arrivals for 2014 are 181 million, and the revenue is 274 billion US dollars, and these are quite high percentages around the world, not as much as Europe perhaps, but still quite high. Tourism is a force in the economy. It cannot be really avoided. And in San Antonio, I was kind of just trying to feel my way into how things are perceived. And yesterday I heard from someone, or this morning, there are people who were completely like put off by this UNESCO thing, so don't mention it too much to some people, kind of. And then I asked about it to the city councilor. She's still here, Miss. I think she's left, and she said, "Oh no, we got over that. That was in the beginning." Like this tourism thing is very controversial, and I like always playing around with it. Like it's symbolically a fire. It can burn your cooking, it can cook your meal. It can burn your stove, or it can burn down your house. It's a dosage is very important. We have some disagreements with some colleagues in ICOMOS. Some of them, like Eric, he doesn't like. I might be going overboard with stories, and I think we can reconcile our different views as it's like a medicine you should take maybe in the homeopathic dose. The right dosage helps you, and you can't overdo it because it's a very degenerative thing as well. But once you're a World Heritage Site, tourism is in the picture, and I'm sure in San Antonio, domestic tourism, international tourism is something on the agenda. I'll skip these world tourism figures, but you can basically just sense how much of a factor it is in the world economy. And the controversy side, basically this degenerative aspect of it, if we would want to go into some of these specificities like the labeling, the tourist gaze, the pollution they create, how as tourists we actually don't want to see other tourists. There's an interesting reason for that. The pressure on cities to reinvent themselves as unique destinations. Some places don't need to try too hard. San Antonio is pretty much like one of the four unique cities of the U.S. You don't need to really add too much to that. Perhaps San Francisco is also pretty much very, very strong in their identity as well. Istanbul is also where I am very strong in that. But actually, I have a small case study at the end about Istanbul, where a particular neighborhood had to reinvent itself for tourism, which also is trying. Basically, it's like to summarize this part with the question of how do we evaluate the effects of tourism on the local population? So the dynamic, the conversation between the local and the visitor, the tourist. Or our different hats, our local hats and our tourist hats, perhaps. Well, the answer seems to be sustainable tourism, the en vogue buzzword of the year. And as long as it takes account of current and future generations' needs, economic, social, environmental needs, impact mitigation, it can be sustainable. It can address needs of both the local community and the visitor. The ICTC, ICOMOS Cultural Tourism Charter, has doctrinized this in quite a good way. I'll just pick out a few words from here. It is an important factor in development when managed successfully. And the primary objective for managing heritage is to communicate its significance and need for its conservation to its host community and to visitors. And sometimes an interpretation effort for visitors can actually help the local community as well. People can discover, I didn't know I had so much rich wealth in my own pockets. That it is a kind of awareness-raising tool in that ironic way. And host communities and indigenous people should be involved in planning for conservation and tourism. And it should benefit the host community ultimately. They are the precedent, the priority. So our case study, to conclude, this is a neighborhood called Eyüp in Istanbul. It's at the northern fringe of the historical peninsula, the World Heritage Site, historic areas of Istanbul. It's not in the World Heritage Site itself. It is a very interesting neighborhood which is really underrated. And the more I got to know about it, in 2015, I was part of a management plan effort back then. The more surprised I was. It was a process of discovering our own urban wealth once again. Because this is historically the first Muslim neighborhood after the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. There are certain myths about how there were dreams that the Sultan Mehmed had, his mentor, the wise man, had about where to dig for the grave of Prophet Muhammad's bones that were, the friend of Prophet Muhammad, Eyüp, his bones were buried in a certain location, and they dug it up and they found some bones, and they felt so good about this. It was an auspicious sign that they conquered Constantinople. This kind of myth is lying there. And today, it's been traditionally known to eat some specialty foods to a certain extent, but mainly for very conservative and lower socioeconomic and what they term group C, D in the economic segments, catering to this kind of population. And there is a huge chaos during Ramadan because the iftars are very, very crowded. There was a crowd control, visitor management issue that the municipality was trying to solve. And it's the only reason that the A, B segments of the economic range come over to Eyüp is for the Pierre Loti Hill. I don't know, maybe some of you have been to Istanbul, you know what I'm talking about. It's a very picturesque hill that the French Orientalist Turcophile Pierre Loti used to come up to and write his journals, etc. So you have this black and white picture of the view he saw from there among the gravestones of the Eyüp cemetery. And we discovered in our surveys with the population and historical research that there were so many different other kinds of layers of heritage in Eyüp. And it could cater to the A, B, C, all of the different economic segments. And I think it was obvious. We understood that it was necessary for the well-being of Eyüp to kind of shake up its clientele and upgrade its physical environmental quality, pollution of signage, as I said, visitor traffic control, etc. And the municipality has actually taken to heart this management plan. It hasn't been officialized. You know, that's an interesting other point. It doesn't always have to be litigated or legislated completely. That's what Donna was, I think, also saying about creative actions or storytelling actions, which are very informal, you know, but they have an impact on the community. Eyüp municipality had the problem of being the little brother or little sister of Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality, and they didn't want to share power about site management with them. They had their own site management directorate, so this plan didn't fly legally, but they have been using it for different components. They did a competition for a logo, a brand. They did an urban design for the main central square. I think they're also starting to use it to influence the metropolitan municipalities' transportation decisions, because the waterfront is not being utilized properly. There are new lines of trams, light rail transport being planned without proper regard for the urban design, the public realm, and surface treatment, so people cannot... Actually, I was in a very interesting municipality meeting with our team, and there were 5 different departments in Istanbul municipality dealing with some kind of transportation, and they weren't talking to each other. They happened to meet each other and find out about their own projects in our site management meeting. And they were going on about how they needed to serve the community with new roads for the cars, and when we said, what about pedestrians? And they said, oh, that's for tourists, that's negligible. So there are these very interesting perceptions in the municipality. But I think with stakeholder negotiations or just rubbing shoulders in different occasions, you start to influence each other very subtly, very subversively, I believe. I think that's all I can say. I might have gone overboard. I hope that was useful. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, I will try to, in this case, I figured more was better. I will try to scroll through these as quickly as possible. I thought the best thing to show you was basically a collection of tools that we use in support of cultural heritage in San Francisco. We won't be able to go too far into detail on the various tools, but I can at least give you a taste of them, and certainly we could talk about them as we break into groups. But again, I thought more was better. And to start, I really wanted to just start with the slide and the title of this slide, and that I called it Cultural Heritage Planning. And I'm sure this is something you've heard Vince talk about a lot and Don Ripkema talk about, and is sort of this notion of, if, again, to sort of beat the drum, if we are going to look at cultural heritage planning as a fully integrated practice and not an outlier issue that needs to be dealt with, we should consider sort of even how we approach the community and our nomenclature in looking at our work as cultural heritage planning. We are slowly doing this, knowing that, after 50 years of doing the same thing, that people are very much wed to certain titles and notions about what preservation planning is. We're starting to do this very slowly through small gestures and documents. We're about to, I hope, adopt finally a cultural heritage element of our general plan that outlines our priorities and policies for cultural heritage planning in San Francisco. And we did have a draft of it that was called the historic preservation element for a very long time, and we made a concerted effort and had a concerted discussion about what that title should be, and we all felt very strongly that it should be renamed the cultural heritage element, because it is our first attempt at integrating all of our policies, whether they're our standard, now considered maybe easy approaches to historic preservation and protecting a building versus the more challenging aspects that we're dealing with today. So I just wanted to start off with that because I do think that's an important aspect of how we approach and communities and deal sensitively with some of these issues. This is just a quick outline of how I would like to organize some of what I'm going to show you. Look at some of our cultural heritage strategy work, how documentation alone can be in support of cultural heritage. I think we've all sort of talked or pondered the notion of what a designation program would look like for cultural heritage. We certainly haven't come to an agreement in San Francisco, but we're starting to have that conversation, and so nothing here is set in stone, but I want to give you or show you a proposal and see what you all think, whether it's a good or bad idea. Talk about zoning support and restrictions. What are the sticks and carrots we can offer at the local level to support cultural heritage again? The really important relationship between private entities and the general public or public partnerships, and then capacity building and community programming. So again, just to start, I don't think I could be doing any of this and my staff without the support of our decision makers and our leadership in the planning department, noting that cultural heritage is an important issue for San Francisco and its people. And through that, we're able to create policies, whether they're in area plans or at a more fine-grained level, that really do support cultural heritage. Our Central Soma plan, which is will be adopted either at the end of this year or the beginning of next year, instead of, again, having a preservation section or a cultural resources section, it's a cultural heritage planning chapter within that document. So cultural heritage strategies, we think, have a number of uses. As a communication tool, we think they strengthen relationships between city agencies and the community on how to work together, encourage results. A framework, we believe, outlines available city services and programs, many of them existing, which we realize the community has no knowledge are actually there for their use. But we can show them how to access these to meet their community's goals and propose new programs to address those unmet needs. A framework can also be used as a marketing tool for a community to seek funding on a broader scale when the city doesn't have the resources to provide, or sometimes where our resources don't align. The city in some situations may not be the best partner for some of the issues the community is looking to solve. But we could certainly use the framework to help support them in seeking solutions to those issues. But like any planning tool, we look at these cultural heritage strategies not as static tools. They're like any other plan. They're meant to evolve over time. You fine-tune them, you see what's working, what's not working, and you should update them to meet either the unmet goals or changes in the values of the community. And finally, as we strive with every cultural heritage strategy, there's always the notion of including the goals of the most vulnerable members of the community, those that are not used to working with the city or engaging the city at this level. And we really rely on the community to provide that conduit and to successfully strategize and helping, one, build capacity within the community, but two is then to reach those vulnerable members of the community to make sure they're being heard. So working on Japantown, as Donna had mentioned, Calle 24, the Filipino community in Soma, and others, we've developed 2 approaches to protect cultural identity. And again, these are, at this point, we're kind of recreating the wheel every time because we are noticing there are some similarities between various groups and what they want to see in their community, but everybody's different and everybody has different wants and needs. The Japantown, or what we call the JCHES report, has a very economic development-driven set of priorities. But you look at the Soma Pilipina report, and they have 60 items on their wish list, which was anything from public health to arts to affordable housing. So really, it depends on, again, hearing from the community to sort of set the agenda and scope what the strategy is going to look like at the end. The LGBTQ cultural heritage strategy is still underway, and again, a completely separate process. But the difference between, to back up, as I mentioned, there are 2 approaches. The difference between the 3 at the top and the 1 at the bottom is the 3 at the top are a place-based approach, where we're looking at a specific geographic area. The community is usually define those geographies, and we can work with them with either supporting legislative controls like a cultural heritage district or a special use district or some sort of zoning overlay to get the oversight they're looking for. And that reflects most of the work we've done to date. However, the LGBTQ cultural heritage strategy is personally my preferred approach, and it's an asset-based approach, so it doesn't draw boundaries, and it allows members of that community to take advantage of the tools no matter where they are in the city. As culture, as we've talked, is fluid and dynamic in many ways, our fear, if we want some longevity to these documents, is if we start declaring boundaries, we may be excluding people in the future or further growth of those districts as they build capacity and strengthen. Either way, both frameworks are community-led engagement, so we do let the community decide what approach they think best fits their needs and what they want to achieve. But the key piece here is while we act more as a facilitator than an expert, we remind the community they are responsible and accountable for making sure that the goals are met in the report. We are there to help them and support them as they move along, but if they want to fully realize the goals they've set out for themselves, they have to take some measure of accountability. So I'm not going to read or go through this diagram in much detail, but I wanted to give you a sense of all the moving pieces within an example of a place-based cultural heritage strategy. This slide shows you the outline. The top portion on the left-hand side outlines why it's important to really identify a champion for the process or a leader within the community to start the process. The middle column includes all the various tools and deliverables that we can implement as a city and helping support the community in developing themselves, maybe even as an organization like a 501c3, to realize the overall strategy. And then the right-hand column gives you a sense of some of the various agencies which even they wouldn't expect to be involved in something like a cultural heritage strategy, but it's actually fairly common for us to be in meetings and realize public health needs to be involved. The Mayor's Office of Economic Workforce Development should be involved. Other city agencies should be involved because they do have, the community is asking them to address some unmet needs within their area. Oh, and I did want to mention again, as I did on the last slide, these efforts also require a significant amount of community resources, which can be difficult for vulnerable communities without capacity or resources to organize. And I think that's I'm glad I read that. That's a really important thing to mention is, and I'm not sure if we have the right answer for it right now. There are a number of communities that have been talking about cultural heritage strategies for more than a decade. And now that we're actually engaging them, I mean, they're thrilled. But because they've been thinking about it so long and they're mobilized, they've been able to hit the ground running. And I have a few examples of projects with a couple communities where they've really have done a wonderful job in a short amount of time. But we do have a number of vulnerable communities, or even communities, we think of community as sort of this broad term, but not realizing that sometimes communities have a lot of varying opinions about how their culture should be expressed because it is such a personal thing. So LGBTQ cultural heritage strategy is a great example of that. After our first meeting, we walked out and said, great, the LGBTQ community is not a community. It is 50 different self-identified groups of folks that all have a different set of priorities, and somehow we need to stitch them all together and get them to work together. So knowing that, we know that strategy is going to be a much longer process than like the Soma Filipino group, who were ready to go and basically on day one handed us a list of demands, which was helpful and it was useful. We knew exactly what we were getting into almost right from the get-go. So an example of documentation that doesn't involve landmark designation is a mural survey that we conducted a couple years ago. And this is a very simple approach. I don't believe takes too many resources, but there were, with the amount of development pressure happening within San Francisco, particularly in the Mission neighborhood, there were several murals that were either destroyed, whether they were painted over, the fence was demolished, or the building was altered in some way. Sometimes there was one where an ATM was cut into the wall of a mural. And the issues were, one is the owners weren't aware that these murals were important, even though they were painted on their property. Two is the city did not have an inventory of these murals, and so we were sort of putting out fires as they came along after permits had been issued and dealing with the headaches of negotiating or mediating between several angry parties. So what we did was, and while this isn't a comprehensive inventory, we went to Precita Eyes, which is one of the leading arts organizations in the Mission, and we asked them, can you teach us about these murals? Which ones are important? Which ones can change over time? Which ones really represent sort of the history of Hispanic culture within the Mission? And they were able to categorize them for us. And by doing that, and again, creating a sort of a database, which is what that's a lot to look at, but it's very helpful when it's in GIS. What that's able to do is flag. Basically, my name and number is listed on every one of those murals as what we call a block book notation. Anytime a permit comes to our counter or is submitted internally, I get a call saying there's a permit in for that site. So I know immediately I can have the planner contact Precita Eyes and make sure that the owner is negotiating or talking about some solution with the artist and the owner to hopefully get an outcome that everybody supports. And then sometimes that's meant cutting out a mural and installing it on a new building if it's really one that's worth preserving. Sometimes it's, oh yeah, you can paint over that. Can you just give us space on your new fence so we can come in and create something new? And it's actually working out fairly well. And it's a very simple way, again, of just recognizing the resource and creating a method to make sure that all parties are talking to each other. We don't want to get involved in sort of stopping a process or requiring a permit for an artist to come in and touch up their own mural. This is a way we can at least get things moving and make sure everybody who has a vested interest is involved. Another example, which I really enjoy, is from Los Angeles. The LA Conservancy has just started a wonderful video program about its LGBTQ history, and it's on Vimeo, and you can all visit it if you like. And there's just these short clips about LGBTQ history. This one was about the Black Cat, which was a location of a very early protest and related to police brutality and profiling at a gay bar before Stonewall, where a lot of allies to the LGBTQ community that felt safe being out in public joined them and protested against the brutality. And now this is a local landmark in Los Angeles, but looking at the building and the bar, you may not know this really important social history associated with the site. So even just creating a short video or promoting this history in other ways, certainly the landmark designation helps to protect from demolition, but the recognition really is the preservation. a local effort that is similar to that we've accomplished in the last couple of years with tremendous help from Mike Buehler is designating the Great Cloud of Witnesses at Ingleside Presbyterian Church. And this, again, is, I feel it was a teaching moment for a lot of folks that didn't understand why the city felt it was important to preserve this building. Now, on the outside, it looks like a very fine, neoclassical religious structure. It's one of the visual landmarks of the Ocean Avenue neighborhood. But really the significance lies in Reverend Gordon's collage, and this is Reverend Gordon here in this slide. In the late 70s, he became the pastor and started thinking of ways he could provide positive role models to the African American youth that were involved in the after-school activities at the church. And what started as one picture of Muhammad Ali grew into basically an art collage that covers almost every visible surface within the entire church. And while this is also a conservation nightmare, thinking of Scotch tape and glue and, aging HVAC and plumbing, it is a rapidly changing community. It's less African American and now more Chinese immigrant and Chinese American. And Reverend Gordon wants to make sure that no matter who's using this church in the next generation understands the story of where this church was and what inspired these inspirational murals throughout the sanctuary, or not the sanctuary space, but throughout the remainder of the church. So this, I think, is important to mention when you're thinking of these resources to protect that may not seem to be traditional in the sense of what we've been doing in the last 50 years. It's really important to understand what the issues could be for the planners of the future, is what we like to call it at work. And so one of the things we initiated, or we asked to be completed as part of the landmark designation, was a conservation report to really figure out, well, what material and substrate are we looking at? How is it aging? What is likely going to be the issue? And how could you preserve what many people just believe is ephemera on this site? And a local preservation firm did a pro bono report for us, came out with some wonderful recommendations on how to prioritize various repairs to the building, looking at natural and artificial light and how that was affecting the collage. But then also suggesting, let's say the water main breaks and you lose an entire wall, high-resolution photo documentation may be a great way for us to document it and then adhere a replica of what was at that wall in the future. Or we could remove all the originals, conserve them, and put up, a representation of what's there. Either way, I think we have a plan now, and we're able to share with the planners of the future of what we think are sensitive treatments to maintaining what could be seen as a unique resource, being that, even internally people were asking me, why are we designating wallpaper? And I would have to explain to them, this is not wallpaper. This is actually the physical embodiment of an entire community throughout the interior of this church through popular culture. So anyway, that conservation document is incorporated into the designating ordinance. So it will always be carried with the property, whether hands change or the commission changes over time. This, just so you know, to the right, this is a part of one of the walls within the gymnasium. And now here's a proposal for criteria. Now I think we have a lot of ideas through the international organizations we rely on that have defined what tangible and intangible cultural heritage is. We understand, scientific, economic, agricultural, political practices, representations of expressions or knowledge or skills. So I think we could heavily rely on those definitions as the significance criteria, meaning if the community can show us how that particular practice or element is valued, instead of looking at integrity, maybe we look at this notion of long-standing. And this is really taken from Mike's work in developing the legacy bars registry and also the city's legacy business registry, in that long-standing really gives you a measure of strength of a resource within a community, knowing that if it's passed on from generation to generation and it still maintains that longevity, but perhaps it's more important than another resource that may be fairly new. But we're not putting necessarily a value saying if something's only 5 years old within a community, it can't be designated. I think local jurisdictions will have to figure out what makes sense, and in the community, what makes sense for them. But I do think it's important that we acknowledge inactive and active resources. There are many sort of traditions that may not be practiced on a regular basis, and so they may be long-standing, but they may be inactive, and so they're part of the collective memory of a community, and there needs to be some recognition for that. Again, it's all relative to culture, so we really do need to rely on the community to provide this information, which is, somewhat similar to the way the state of California deals with traditional cultural properties related to native lands. And then also acknowledging that cultural values change as the resource will change. This is probably the hardest part of it. It may necessitate a completely different program than landmark designation, meaning that if a community comes to you and says, well, that's no longer representative of our culture, could you please remove that nomination or that designation from it? That may very well make sense, the same way we look at a legacy business, and if the legacy business changes hands and their menu no longer contains particular dishes that are representative of that business, that they would be removed from the registry. Maybe we do the same thing with cultural heritage resources in acknowledging their value for the time the community sees that value in place. And then just to talk a little bit about the legacy business program, I think Mike covered it fairly well, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the criteria that are outlined, at least with the city program. There are certain caveats. The business has to be in operation for a minimum of 30 years with a break of no more than 2 years. However, if a business is operated for at least 20 years and they're at risk of displacement, which we often, we'll get letters in the applications that show like their lease isn't being renewed or the building's being demolished or the building's being sold, that could sort of qualify a younger business for listing on the registry, and the commissions do take that criteria very seriously. As Mike said, they're approved by the Small Business Commission as they're sort of the keepers of the purse of the funds, but our Historic Preservation Commission provides input on whether or not they've met the threshold of being a significant element or a contributor to the history and identity of the neighborhood or the culture. And we do outline both tangible and intangible assets with it, is what we call them, in the registry. So we will mention, the old neon sign, the fact that there's, tall booths, the servers are dressed a certain way, they have a certain number of dishes on their menu related to this culture, et cetera. Sometimes the lighting, those sorts of things, knowing that if the business changes hands, if those elements or assets can remain in place, likely the registry recognition can also stay in place. And the way this program is growing, I think, has been really reassuring to the community in that now our supervisors, which are our city council, is looking at different ways to strengthen the program. So, for example, in one neighborhood, the Calle 24 neighborhood, I mentioned, that also has a strategy in place. They now have an SUD, and that SUD says if you displace a legacy business, you have to go get approval for your new project or your new use at the Planning Commission. So they're basically requiring a public hearing for displacing a legacy business. What we're trying to do is add a carrot to that as well in saying, well, if the owner or the developer finds a new home for that legacy business, either within the existing building or within the neighborhood, they could actually remove that public hearing requirement because they've been able to maintain the business. And we're hoping that that will at least give people notice that, legacy businesses, for what it's worth, is largely an honorific, distinction. It doesn't have a lot of teeth, but the city is paying attention. And sure, you could go through the public hearing process and still get approved, but you are at sort of you are being held to a higher standard, and the commission, one, would have to find criteria that shows that it's necessary and desirable to remove that legacy business, and two is it gives the public an opportunity to come to a hearing and voice their concern or opposition on the displacement of that business. So another program that, again, maybe not on the face value, looks like a in support of cultural heritage, but has been a useful tool for us in sort of releasing a little bit of the gentrification pressure or the displacement pressure in San Francisco. As you know, we've been going under incredible development pressures, and people have been leaving the city in droves because of affordability issues. One program that's actually helping is the accessory dwelling unit program, which basically allows for owners to add additional units, greater density to their existing building without expanding the building envelope. The nice thing about this is it could also, allow for new units without displacing residents. And another benefit we see is if you have, let's say, an older homeowner that wants to cash in on the success of development at that time, it gives them a way to take a benefit from development in the market and participate without actually wholesale selling to a flipper or a developer. And then, there are design guidelines that require these projects to conform with the character and the context of the building and the neighborhood. So again, by providing additional units without destroying or demolishing existing units has been a great way for us to provide another carrot to help stabilize or release some of the pressure that some of these lower income neighborhoods are facing. Another proposal that's part of the Central SOMA plan is a prohibition on small lot mergers. This is sort of a unique approach that we're using for what I'll call 6L properties. The state of California has a number of status codes that we apply to a property when it's surveyed. 6L basically means it's not a resource, but it should be considered in local planning. What we've done is basically listed a number of properties as 6L, saying, well, they're nice buildings. They're not necessarily historic based on our criteria, but we're actually going to prohibit you from demolishing those by merging the lots to create a larger development. And what we call these is pretty much character buildings. And what it says here under number 2 is character buildings are meant to enhance SOMA. The historic development patterns should be preserved. And this is really talking about historic development patterns, not in the preservation sense, but more of just the quality of life of the neighborhood. But it also gets at what we call PDR, production, distribution, and repair, which is essentially a light industrial zoning use. And because there is this area of Central SOMA historically was a light industrial area, and there are a lot of other uses that qualify for light industrial, whether you're making backpacks or bicycles, or the whole maker industry qualifies under PDR in San Francisco. It helps preserve jobs, and it helps preserve those uses because it takes that development pressure off of those smaller properties that could be consolidated for a larger development. And one of the carrots that we're trying to propose to those buildings is if they aren't consolidated, or because we won't let you consolidate them into a larger development, we will let you sell off the air rights or the development from the property, so to ensure that that property is maintained over time. And so on the right-hand side, at the top right, it gives you an example of some of those small-scale light industrial properties. I mean, they're all very fine buildings. They just don't rise to the level of being landmark quality. And on a personal level, the reason why I think this is so important is I take ukulele lessons in one of those buildings. So the fact that that shared workspace can stay there is because the rents are affordable. And my ukulele instructor probably wouldn't be able to afford the rent in that shared space should those buildings be demolished. So this gives you, these two maps will give you a sense of what that looks like on the ground, or from an aerial view, in that on the left-hand side, all of those colored properties, those are all various types of historic resources. And on the right-hand side, the red lines are the street frontages where those buildings are prohibited from being consolidated. And you can see they match up fairly closely together. Where they don't are essentially those 6L properties. So preservation, in terms of our staff, we still have a role in reviewing these properties to make sure that that character and those uses are preserved, but we're not necessarily looking at the preservation of the bricks and mortar of those structures. And then finally, the last few slides really talk about public-private partnerships and capacity building. Again, another project in the South of Market area, which really shows how a public-private partnership can help stabilize a small business and a culturally significant space in the community. So South of Market, as I mentioned, is largely an industrial neighborhood. It's increasingly more mixed use and residential, but there is a severe lack of open space. And as these new residential properties are being developed, they may be providing their own private open space, but still the public realm is pretty bleak. So one developer acknowledging, there is a lack of public open space, and acknowledging the city's conundrum, and we're trying to find a lot to develop for public open space, because they were developing a new site, or an empty parking lot for new residential units, and it was directly across the street from the Eagle Bar, which was a long-standing bar that's significant to not only the LGBTQ leather community, but just the South of Market LGBTQ community. They decided to create something called Eagle Plaza. And this developer has a not-for-profit arm where they're able to provide expertise and create a group between their not-for-profit arm and the community members to create this sort of plaza, Friends of Eagle Plaza group that will be responsible for maintenance and programming of the plaza. And the design of the plaza was largely influenced by images and colors associated with the Soma leather community. Another example is Ringgold Alley. Oh, sorry, these are out of order. Let me jump to this real quick. So this is the development that's across the street from the Eagle. So there's a few great things about this. One is that you have this public open space that not only the residents get to take advantage of, but the Eagle can now use for programming for, if it's a nice day, they can open up and have events there, or have their beer garden spill out into this area. But secondly is it's named Eagle Plaza. And again, this goes back to recognition alone can be a form of preservation. I think it would be very hard in the future for somebody to argue, whether you're a resident or another constituent or a new developer coming in to buy up land and maybe demolish the Eagle. I think it would be very hard to argue why the Eagle is not now an integral part of this community, being that it's now physically connected to this new development through this public open space. So it really shows you how, again, naming conventions alone and the recognition of the history within a public environment can go a long way in showing people why something's important. And then to back up really quickly, this is another example that's a few blocks away, Ringgold Alley, which there's a humongous development on an old bus yard right next to it. And Ringgold Alley was actually a fairly notorious cruising location in the 60s and 70s. And the Soma leather community wanted to memorialize that cruising history. And so working with cultural historians and members of the community, they came up with basically this leather walk right here that identifies important bars that opened up and have closed over time, representations of their flag within the colored and tinted pavement, and then these boots that act as markers of important or influential people in San Francisco's leather community. And then finally, again, the Soma Filipino Cultural Heritage District working group is probably our best organized group at this point in terms of really getting their name out there and showing visibility through innovative programming. They have a very interesting history that I don't have time to go into right now, but one of the most important buildings in San Francisco is located within their neighborhood, which is the Old Mint, which is one of the oldest buildings in San Francisco. They are now using the area around the Mint, which has been largely unprogrammed at night, as a night market to represent some of the traditional night markets that happen in Asia. And so through programming with arts, music, other activities, and even showing off the history of the Mint and providing access to the Mint, they're able to activate that space and build not only their own capacity, but create awareness around their own programming and what they're trying to do. And they've been hugely successful in getting featuring Filipino businesses and restaurants that are now moving into the neighborhood, sort of giving their spiel to anybody who will listen about how to get involved and how to promote other sort of Filipino-related artists or activities within the neighborhood. So we're really looking at them as sort of like the gold standard right now on how to sort of take control over or ownership over your own history and identity within a community and really promote it to your own advantage. So I think some of the examples that they are providing us right now, we will certainly be sharing with other folks as well. So I'm sorry, I probably ran a bit long, but I wanted to share all of those with you, and thank you for your time.
Well, it's a multifaceted topic, and I think we got a flavor for a number of the dimensions to the question. I'm a little bit daunted at trying to summarize what we heard. Sure.
I found it really interesting the idea that you have to let some things die. I mean, is that part of living? I mean, maybe it is. Because sometimes, for example, with artisanal traditional crafts, in many places, you find it naturally dying out, and you're really pushing hard to almost artificially make them live. And I sometimes wonder, I mean, is this perhaps not fully right or something? And I wonder if this living heritage strategy might have two strands to it. One of them is keeping things living when they can be kept living, and if they have to die out, then other kinds of commemoration, do they also count as part of living heritage? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, just to maybe try to summarize a few of the points. I think that goes directly to one that occurred to me also, which is given the multiplicity of ways that we can conceive of living heritage, it also admits of a multiplicity of ways to conserve it, and those can range from everything from documentation to video archives to incentives to denying permits where the project is going to change the capacity of the place to sustain that living heritage. But there's such a mixture of ways that you can conceive of living heritage. It admits of a whole variety of outcomes, and that the right outcome isn't always using the regulatory power of the government to insist that a particular former approach be continued at that spot. A couple of other things I'll just quickly flag, and then we have time, I think, for a few questions, although we'll maybe be a little shorter than last time. I'm struck by how in the variety of ways that the question of kind of the layers on a place and the multiple stories of a place. So Donna gave kind of a quintessential example of a building that started off built by German immigrants and then was occupied by Norwegian immigrants and then Japanese immigrants and then, I guess we'll say Quakers. And then
You're getting them all mixed up, but that's fine.
Yeah.
Because it's all layered.
The why? Yeah.
The women's building was
The
German,
women's building was,
Norway,
I am mixing them, fine, you're right. And then in the case of the Y, at least reclaimed by the Japanese and the like. So, which of those layers are we going to recognize as the social heritage of the spot? And is it a function of who's the loudest or the most organized? Is it a function of, it's a lot of questions about the layers on a place. And when we declare that this is Japantown, what else was there? And is that going to be deprioritized and the like? So these layers, multi-stories and multiple stories, and how to think about that, particularly when we've decided to use the money or the power of the government to insist that something be a certain way. Which of those layers? I think that goes directly into a second question, a related question of significance, and Tim talked about that. Particularly when you're starting to use the taxpayers' money for something, when you're using the regulatory power of the government, at some point there's going to be questions asked about whether or not this is privileging a very idiosyncratic or private idea, or is there some broader significance, some value that's recognized by a greater number of people. And so how does this idea of significance play out, particularly when you're going to the length of putting the public support behind a particular idea? Now, of course, the public support could be in the form of helping produce a YouTube video. That's a lot different than the public support being telling a private building owner they can't make a change to their building they want to make, right? But nonetheless, at some level, it has to be justified in terms of significance. I think Ege made a very good point about the risks of being too singularly focused on specific proposals that can be tagged to a particular parcel. So in my own life, I was invited to be a part of a process in the city of Dubrovnik in Croatia, which is a World Heritage City. A lot more Americans know about Dubrovnik now than they used to because it's one of the places where Game of Thrones is filmed. And it's an amazing World Heritage City. But the city has, many said, been a victim of over-tourism and the cruise ship industry. And now in the historic center of Dubrovnik, fewer and fewer permanent residents, fewer and fewer community-serving retail, much, much more catering to transient tourists, particularly cruise ship tourism. And so there's been a lot, UNESCO sort of demanded that the city address these questions. And there were lots of meetings about ways to encourage community-serving retail and retain long-time residents, and I attended two of these as an international guest. And on our way out of town, I saw this gigantic construction project. And I said, what is that? And they said, oh, the city's expanding the cruise ship terminal. And I thought, okay, why didn't someone mention to me that at the same time we're talking about retaining community-serving retail, you want to double the number of cruise ships that can come to this town every day? So, a singular focus on that parcel where that local store was in downtown, in the heart of Dubrovnik, is not really going to get to the issue of whether or not Dubrovnik will retain its character. So anyway, a few points. Oh, the last thing I really wanted to note that was mentioned are questions that go, maybe we could call them to landscape scale, or maybe architects would say morphology, but I like this idea of how the scale or the layout or the spatial physicality of a place can be the crucible for intangible values. So maybe what's really supporting a particular intangible value is the density of the neighborhood, the mixture of small buildings and the way they are cobbled together. And so, the National Trust has this, older, smaller, better report. Is that what it's right? Older, smaller, better, which is a report from the National Trust Green Lab that found that neighborhoods with older, smaller buildings did a better job of incubating creativity. And it was this intermixture of the public spaces and the way the buildings were, the mixture of spaces and densities. And so maybe it's really that needs to be valued in the planning process, because that's what's supporting the intangibles. Or maybe it's the mixture of public space and private space, and these. So sometimes it's sort of a landscape scale. Okay, anyway, some of the points that struck me from what we heard. So we have, Shannon, let's do a reality time check.